So I'm really excited to introduce Abigail and Rich. This session is entitled What We've Learned from Interviewing 100 Christian Activists. So I'm really quite excited and intrigued to see what they've found out and heard. I'll give you a really brief description, introduction to these guys. So Abigail is a radio and podcast producer and writer. She has worked for both Independent and BBC Radio, and her first documentary about restorative justice won a Jerusalem Award. As well as making the Hopeful Activists Podcast, Abigail helps with the food and community project in her church and finds joy in practicing hospitality, helping new people feel welcome in the UK and eating custard. Nice. And Rich is a former government economist who escaped from the civil service and now leads the Praxis Centre for Hope and Activism, as well as working with Tearfund. He's passionate about social movements for justice and restoration, and knows how hard and rewarding activism can be, having spent several years working at the grassroots stages in the UK and Zimbabwe. So I'm really excited to hand over to you guys. Over to you.
Thanks, Emily, and hey everyone. It's funny having your bio read out when you're there. There you go. That's kind of who we are. So we're coming up to our 100th episode of the Hopeful Activists Podcast. So Abby and I had been thinking, what have we learned from interviewing all of these people? And then we had the opportunity to do this seminar. So we thought, well, why don't we put all this learning into a seminar, see if we can boil it down to 20 minutes. So we'll leave 5 minutes for questions at the end. And we realized that all of this wisdom and advice from activists is actually very similar to the advice you give your kids when they're learning to cross the road. So this is the stop, look and listen of activism. That's what we're going to do. Stop, look, listen before you go. Okay, so stop, first of all, stop, slow down. And we're going to kick this one off with a quote from one of the very first people that we interviewed, Natalie Collins. She's a campaigner. She's often challenging the church around issues of gender justice. And this is one of the key things that she had to say.
I would say that anybody who feels called to challenge the church, that the most important thing to do is build your relationship with God. Have dedicated time with God, spiritual practices, I spend a day a month with God, a weekend a year. Every day I spend time with God, because if you are going to be challenging the status quo, you have to be sure that you are listening to God and that you can hear God above all else, because actually the church is supposed to be the compass for Christians. It's supposed to be the place that helps us to learn how to follow God. And if you feel you're called to be a person who is saying, I don't think you're doing this as well as you could be doing, then actually the most important thing to do is to find ways to become more and more obedient to God, to be able to hear from God.
It's such an obvious point, right? I'm sure, most seminars on Christian activism start with pray, listen to God, the same point. But honestly, we often forget it as activists. A lot of activists live on the edge of burnout, and I'm talking from experience here. But if we can learn to cultivate a discipline of silence and solitude and time with God, then we can learn to operate out of the overflow of the presence of God rather than constantly living on the edge of ourselves. So we're going to listen to a clip now from one of the most recent interviews we did, which was with the Reverend Edwin Arison, who's a close friend of Archbishop Desmond Tutu. So after the Arch's death, we interviewed him about his relationship with Archbishop Desmond Tutu. We think, he was someone at absolutely the sharp end of activism under so much pressure. How did he cope with that? And this is what Edwin had to say.
The Arch was very close to God every single day. What he did and what he said publicly was born and nurtured in many, many hours of silence in the daily Eucharist. That's where it all started. And I would really want to encourage, particularly young Christian activists, to make time for silence, because it is out of the silence that true solidarity will come. Otherwise, you're just a noisy gong. You make a lot of noise, but there has to be depth to the solidarity, and the depth will come because you seek the deeper things.
There's so many clips I could have played about this point, about stop. It really is a thread that runs through so many of our interviews. I'm just going to share one poem about it, though, that the Northumbria community often share. It's from a song by Donovan Leitch, and it goes like this. If you want to live life free, take your time, go slowly. Do few things, do them well. Simple joys are holy. So with that, we're going on to look inside. Abby?
So this is a theme we again often come back to, and it's self-reflection, investing in your own character, investing in your own development, looking within, being open to personally changing, to new ideas, and being willing to take that honest look at yourself. Ben Lindsay runs a charity called Power the Fight, which works against youth violence, and is also the author of We Need to Talk About Race. And he talks about the power of therapy.
One of the reasons why I was able to write the book, one of the reasons why I can have these conversations again and again, is because 7 years ago, I decided to get clinical supervision. So as a pastor, before becoming a pastor and leading my own church, I was working for a mental health charity, and it was probably the first time where I saw professionals receive regular clinical supervision, regular therapy. So when I did become a pastor of the church, I wanted that to be part of the norm. And I got a bit of pushback, but I decided to just try and lead the way on it. And for me, a lot of those conversations involved race, racism, prejudice, just trying to have somewhere where I could bounce that. And honestly, I think I've said this recently elsewhere, if you are black and brown, please, and if you listen to this, please get some culturally competent therapy. Get some therapy which you're able to, even if you feel there's nothing wrong, it will help you so much when another person is shown to be killed on television, or a black person in America being brutally taken out by the police. Again, when you are going through that secondary trauma, when you're having those conversations again and again with your friends, with your family, in a church context, honestly, it's just prepared me. I no longer get angry in these conversations because I feel like I've been able to express my emotion and anger behind closed doors. The work is not, I won't say it's been done, it's not finished, but it's ongoing. So my thing would be to young people, to anybody, please look into that.
And on a also self-care note and examining yourself note, Jo Musker-Sherwood, who was the founder of Hope for the Future and now runs Climate Emergence, shared with us about her terrible experience of burnout, which Rich mentioned earlier was something that he's come close to himself. She was growing an incredibly successful organization, and the weight of it just became too much. And she has come out of that using the sort of language of her faith has really helped her, talking about resurrection, new growth, new life, and has now come to a place where she is helping and supporting other environmental activists to look after themselves. So this is what she said about the 4 practices she takes.
I've got 4 practices that I do every single day, and they can squeeze into half hour of the day. They conveniently, they're all words, so they're grace, grounding, gratitude, and growth. So I have a 10-minute stillness practice every day. That might be prayer for some people, it might be mindfulness and meditation, but something where we just stop and we notice how we're feeling and we connect with something bigger than ourselves. Grounding is like doing something that gets us out of our heads and minds, which can become incredibly anxious, and into our bodies. So it could be smelling a really nice smell, or it could be anything that kind of gets us into our bodies. Gratitude, writing out 10 things we're grateful for at the end of each day. Our brains are hardwired to notice all the scary, threatening things in life, but not necessarily the things that we're grateful for. So just trying to counteract that negativity bias. And the final one, growth, doing a bit of journaling. I do a bit of journaling each day, just trying to figure out how I'm growing and where the journey's going.
So that's look, take an honest look at yourself and take care of yourself.
So that's stop and look. Now listen. We've talked about our practice of listening to God. What about listening to your community, or rather to the voices of those that you perhaps want to serve or that you might want to act on behalf of? So the Reverend Dr. Sam Wells, who leads St. Martin in the Fields in London, they're a church who do a lot of work with people who are homeless. He has a really good theological reflection on this. And our interview with him is called The Power of Being With. And he's going to unpack that concept in this little quote.
Well, I always put it like this. You're crossing Trafalgar Square and you meet a homeless person. And there's really 4 things you can do. You can go away and you can set up an organisation, and you can get very cross about how much homelessness there is on the streets, and you set up an organisation and you can sort it out. The second thing you can do is to pull together a coalition of all the interested parties, local business leaders, local council, voluntary groups, churches, and homeless people themselves. And then you can try and fix the problem that way. The third option is you can sit down with a cup of tea with the homeless person that you've just met, and you can talk about the Premier League, or whether we need a new Prime Minister, or the colour of the sky. And the fourth option is you can go home and you can get on your blog and say we should never use phrases like the homeless. We should always talk about homeless people, because their humanity gets lost in the conversation too often. So I've got a name for each of these 4 approaches. The first approach, where you set up the organisation and fix the problem, I call working for. The second approach, where you build the coalition, I call working with. The sitting down and talking about the Premier League, I call being with. And the going back and blogging and telling everybody else they use the wrong language is what I call being for. And they've all got their strengths and weaknesses. If you look at the percentages of Jesus' life, he spent maybe a week in Jerusalem working for us, maybe 3 years in Galilee working with us, and then 30 years in Nazareth being with us. And I think those percentages, if you work them out, 1% working for, 9% working with, and 90% being with, tell us about incarnation. So every time we default to working for, we're basically saying God didn't really know how to do an incarnation. God had never done one before. We, of course, know how to do incarnations. We do them all the time. And from our vast experience, we think it should be 90% working for. And obviously, from the way I portrayed it, you can tell that I'm sort of ridiculing our default setting.
I find this challenge both life-giving and quite difficult, because I spend most of my time is spent working for Tearfund, where I lead some of the global advocacy work. And the natural default with all of that kind of global campaigning stuff is working for rather than being with. And I think in a lot of these global issues, climate change, plastic waste, there is this strong pull to working for. But we really need, if we're going to be authentic activists and follow the model Jesus had, we really need to think about how are we going to do being with. So Shane Claiborne, when we interviewed him, he talked about how when he's been working on a sort of campaigning issue, he just wants to spend a day hanging out with the kids that live locally to him, just to get that grounding of community activism linked with the global activism. And I think we also have to recognize as activists that in a lot of things, the whole ballgame, the whole aim should be to empower the people who are most suffering from an issue, be the ones who address it and speak to it. So we hear in interviews a lot, interviews with people working with young people. Well, our whole aim is to get young people to take control of their own lives, take agency, to run the projects, or projects working with survivors of trafficking. The whole aim is for those survivors to become overcomers, to become people that can set stuff up and run with it themselves. So this idea of the power of being with, of listening to those whose interests we want to speak to, is a really important challenge for us to think about as activists. So that's stop, look and listen. We've covered loads of ground. Now it's go.
So having said all that, once you've had that time of reflection, we would definitely say go. Like, don't let all this stop you from going, because one of the main ways that we learn to be healthy activists is through our praxis, through getting on with it. We've spoken to so many activists, and not a single one of them has said, I wish I hadn't done what I've done, or I wish I'd stopped. Of course, there is a time sometimes to bring a project to a close, but don't let any of that self-reflection or time of worship stop you from cracking on and doing what God's asked you to do. So there are 3 points in this section: are crack on, get a team, and persevere. And this is the advice of Jared Hodgson from Hope at Home, who provides safe housing for people who've come out of trafficking or modern day slavery.
Do it. My advice is do it. Don't wait for everything to be lined up. If you've got a seed of an idea, find people that you can talk to that will be dream encouragers and not dream snatchers. Find people that will stand alongside you and champion you and join in. Realize that it's going to sometimes be difficult, and keep track of what God said to you from the beginning, so you can go back to it and encourage yourself with it.
And finally, we're going to hear from Mariam Tadros, who's a regional director for an incredible peace-building organisation called International Alert. And she talks about, it's a quote from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who said, "We shall overcome because the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice." Patience is part of your character. Like, you seem to be able to take the long view. I'm not like that.
Well, it's easy to do that behind a microphone, but you're right. I mean, pacing is such an important part of it, and I learned that the hard way. I spent many of my years in the humanitarian sector, where urgency is of the utmost characteristic that you carry, and sometimes that's absolutely necessary, and you have to be urgent because the needs are urgent. I think in peace building, I've learned mostly from seeing prolonged crises, prolonged conflicts, that the long view is the thing that keeps you going. And really believing in that arc towards justice, and that eventually it gets there, but that does not take away from the day-to-day frustrations of how slow that can feel and be. If we do peace building well, we have to have 20 and 30-year visions. These 1 year, 2 year, 3 year cycles of funding and projects don't get us very far, to be honest.
So my message would be, once you go, unless God tells you to, don't stop. So that's our stop, look, listen, go. We'd love to be able to support you and encourage you in your activism, whatever that looks like. So I would recommend having a listen to this podcast episode on the screen here called Campaign Successes, Starting Something New. This is the story of 3 fantastic, successful campaigns. 2 of them are environmental, 2 in England and 1 in Malawi. If you'd like to get a flavour of what we're about. We also run the Praxis Labs, which there's 2 courses to help you to develop your activism, to start new projects, but to do it from a basis of love and from an ethical and with longevity. And we also have a community. We have a Facebook community and also regular Zoom meetings with our community, where we'd love to support you in your activism. And of course, there is the Hopeful Activists Podcast, which we hope will be a really good resource for you in your activism. So get your phones out, get your barcode scanner on, and you can scan our little codes to have a listen to 99 episodes, soon to be 100 episodes of the Hopeful Activists Podcast.
And I'd just say, if you want to access, if that support the labs or the community, our website is praxiscentre.org, with centre spelt the English way, RE at the end. There's a lot of organisations called Praxis and lots of sort of things called Praxis Labs or similar. So find our website, you can make sure that's the right one. That's it. So we've saved a bit of time for questions. If anyone has any questions.
Yeah, feel free to put a question in the chat, or just unmute yourself and ask. Thank you so much, Abby and Rich, for what you shared. I definitely need to, once all the recordings are available, go back and listen again and digest that, because there's so many good things covered in there. So thank you.
Thank you.
Well, if anyone has any questions, do put them in. I think I'd love to ask, when times aren't feeling hopeful, when there were, we spoke a lot in the beginning of this idea of kind of drawing close to God and grounding yourself, and maybe silence is probably the most helpful thing in this respect. But when God feels far, and you're trying to hold on, but it feels like you're the only one holding yourself on at that point, how do you keep going in that case? Just an easy one.
Yeah. Do you want to answer that, Rich, or shall I go first?
We've posed that question to a lot of people, definitely, and the answer that stands out for me, we posed it to a friend of mine from when I used to live in Zimbabwe, called Kelly Nkube, who's an activist in Zimbabwe, not the easiest place to be an activist. And she said in answer to that, firstly, make sure you are spending time with God when things are good, because to suddenly find a practice of silence and prayer when things are hard can be difficult. So invest when things are good. But she said, go back, to what God said to you in the light and hold on to that in the dark, which I found very helpful. Abby, what about you?
Yeah, and I think having a team is really, really important. That's something that, again, is a regular answer for people. I do run a very small local campaign that I run by myself, but I do have other people around me who are champions, who support me. And when I find one of my leaflets torn up on the floor, they're the one that'll pick me up and say, don't worry, it's okay, you're doing the right thing. So yeah, having a team around you, and people praying for you, and who can be an honest reflection to you of how things are going, and not afraid to tell you the truth is really important, I think. It's a good question, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I'd love to ask another one if nobody has any thoughts. It's a joy working with people, and I know this is another easy little question, but conflict. How do you deal with conflict? Maybe you've got those who want to try certain methods of activism, and others who are quite against those. How do you deal with that?
Yeah, I think, if you don't mind me answering this one, Rich, listening is super important in that case. Just for people to be heard is half the way to get to a solution. So you don't have to agree, but you do have to understand why people think what they think and where that comes from. And I think once you've all understood each other, it's often easier to have compassion and to find a joint way forward.
Yeah, I think on that, sometimes our conflicts come from genuine disagreements, and sometimes they come from just being triggered, people being triggered by the conversations, particularly when we're talking about things that we care deeply about. And so what Ben Lindsay was talking about, they're getting therapy, sort of reflecting yourself on what's going on for you and building a practice of that in your team is really important, I think. And that can help people when they come to sort of decision-making discussion to be, I guess, dispassionate, to say, I'm really passionate about this, but I can also see it from other people's perspective. I can almost sit in their chair in the room and say it from their perspective. Like, there's a good course called the Difference course that Lambeth Palace developed about dealing with conflict. We interviewed them about that, and that's what's coming out.
Great, thank you. We've had a few more questions come in, and I know that we're kind of coming to the end of our time. I'll put them out there in case any brief final summaries come to mind. I think you've probably covered a lot of this in what you've just shared, but in case you'd want to add anything, any expansion on this idea of being with and what that looks like in the context of climate activism, and any particular recommendations for those who want to connect with others, encouraging each other. Yeah, where are the places that people can go if they find themselves a bit stranded?
Yeah, so being with and climate activism is a tough one. Honestly, things like, global injustice and being with can be difficult things to work out. But I think it means things like seeking to amplify the voices of those who are most affected. So thinking about the big word, but the intersectionality between climate change and race, for example. So there's a book, Climate Change is Racist by Jeremy Williams. It's good on that. Thinking about how are we amplifying the voices of affected communities and what we're doing. And that can be international, but it can also mean, you know, locally, who are the people that have been affected by floods? How can we work with them, bring their voices into this space, and not just it be about those of us with the time speaking on behalf of others all of the time. So it often, unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, means spending quite a lot of time just investing in relationships, seeking to meet people, have coffee, understand their issues, which can sometimes feel like a waste of time. But that's the thing about the power of being with. Actually, it's not a waste of time. And if we do invest in that, it really enriches what we're doing. But that's something that I've wrestled with. So I work on like global plastic stuff a lot of the time. It's similar problem.
Yeah, and just quickly on the community, Lynn suggested people get involved with Christian Climate Action, which is fantastic. We've interviewed people from there as well, and they're a fantastic organisation. There's loads of organisations around. So if you want to join our Facebook community, we can ping about suggestions about that, and I'm sure that Luke could make other suggestions of people to connect with in the area of environmental activism.
Wonderful. Thank you so much again, Abby and Rich, for all that you shared. And for those of you who've participated and joined in, do continue to look up and those resources that have been shared. And again, if you want to rewatch, all of this will be available in a couple of weeks' time as a recording. So thank you so much for joining us and for sharing. We're going to take an hour's break now or so to get some dinner and be back in room 1 for Shane Claiborne at 7. So I look forward to seeing you then. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks, Emily.